I was asked a question recently in response to an article I wrote called The Sacredness of Being, in which I described how on my walks, when I go on my walks with my dog in the woods, there's a sacred quality to the moment. There's a sacred quality to the trees. There's a sacred quality to the forest, to the air, to the moment. And I was asked a question about how one can tap into or feel the sacredness in one's environment. And the thing is, with most people, we're in search of this sacred aspect of life in the quiet moments, in the beautiful moments, the meditative moments. But the sacredness of being is ever present because being is ever present. Being is the fundamental substrate upon which this entire reality that we see around us exists. So the question is not how to orchestrate the sacredness. The question is not what kinds of practices do I need to do? Do I need to meditate more? Do I need to go on walks in nature? Do I need to buy a dog to be able to do that like you do? Those are the wrong kinds of questions because we're looking for a format in which that sacredness exists. What I'm saying is that sacredness is absolute because being is absolute. Being is simply the fundamental quality of what is, right? It's not something esoteric that I'm talking about here. It's a fundamental quality of what is. As you watch me now speak to you, whatever device you're watching me on is. The device carries the fundamental quality of what is, of being. My image carries that fundamental quality. My words carry that fundamental quality. The pauses between my words carry that fundamental quality. Your body sitting on that chair as you watch this carries that fundamental quality. The room around you, the environment carries that fundamental quality. Every single item and aspect and experience and thought and emotion and sensation that arises in the moment carries that fundamental aspect of being, of isness, because it simply is what is happening. It isn't what you wish would be happening. It isn't what did happen. It isn't what is going to happen. It isn't what should happen. It is what is happening. That isness of that thing, that phenomenon, is what gives it its reality. Even thoughts have a reality because they are. The content of the thought doesn't have reality. So if you're imagining an apple, the apple doesn't have the isness, but the thought of the apple has isness, as opposed to an actual apple sitting on the table. So what is the thought of the apple. What is the mental image of the apple. And so everything that you are experiencing carries that quality of isness. So then it makes no sense that you should meditate in order to perceive that isness, or that you should walk in the woods in order to perceive that isness. If anything, perhaps it might place you in a more open state of mind, more receptive state of mind, but that's about it. That has more to do with your state of mind. It has nothing to do with the isness of the moment. As I said, that isness is universal. It is absolute. But what is truly profound to contemplate is that even anger has an isness. Even hatred has an isness. Even conflict has an isness. Even death has an isness. Disease has an isness. Violence has an isness. War has an isness. Darkness, negativity, depression, anxiety, fear, all of these qualities have an isness to them when they arise. Not as absolute conditions, but in the moment that they arise, they contain a quality of isness, which is the very fundamental basis upon which they can even arise. When you say, I am afraid, what you're really saying, that fear is. When you say, I am anxious or stressed, what you're really saying is that anxiety is, that stress is, the anger, the envy, the jealousy is, the conflict, the argument, the suspicion, the mistrust is. And so even these things carry a quality of isness. And therefore, and thereby, that isness itself is always present. And so even these things are sacred because the sacredness of being is a fundamental quality of being. Being is the hallowed ground. Being is the holy ground. Being is the sacred ground. And so anger is sacred. Hatred is sacred. Violence is sacred. All of it is sacred only when it arises, not as a fundamental truth. I'm not saying anger as an entity or an experience in the abstract is sacred. I'm saying anger, when it arises within your system, contains a fundamental sacredness to it because it is. And we struggle with this because we are fundamentally orientated towards a binary, dualistic view of life, in which all that is good is holy, is sacred, is divine, and all that is base, negative, dark, undesirable is not sacred, is not divine, is not holy. This would be where these terms unholy, evil come from, because they're based on a dualistic perception of reality. Yet when you perceive that everything fundamentally is, there's an absolute quality to that isness. There's nothing you can perceive in your environment right now that is not. Everything carries the fundamental quality of being. And that being is sacred ground. So the question then arises, well, how do I perceive the sacredness in my own anger? How do I perceive the sacredness in my own envy? How do I perceive the sacredness in another person's harmful actions? How do I perceive the sacredness in what I perceive to be fundamentally destructive to the harmony and well being of others? How do I perceive the sacredness in that? How do I perceive the sacredness in the Gaza conflict? How do I perceive the sacredness in what is happening in Ukraine? A walk in the woods, that I can I can at least try and grok, even if I can't feel it, I can intellectually grok it. But how does one feel the sacredness in these heinous things occurring in the world around us? But the problem is the reason you are experiencing this conflict, the reason you see this as a paradox, is because you're searching for the sacredness in the content that you see around you. You look at the world of forms and you confuse the forms as being sacred or not. And so you see a building like a church or a temple or a monastery. You go, oh, well, that looks like a sacred place. Because sacred things happen there and sacred conversations, and people contemplate sacred things and wear sacred clothes and behave sacredly. And then you look at a um, missile base, or even worse, a gulag or a concentration camp, and you go, well, this is the most unsacred establishment that human beings could even conceive of. I want nothing to do with this unsacred place. I want to go to that sacred place. Or you meet the kind of people you feel are sacred. They have a certain demeanor. They're peace loving. They're congenial. They're kind. They seem compassionate. They're understanding and accepting. And you go, well, that is a sacred person. That is a holy man. That is a holy woman. And then you encounter people who are the opposite, opportunistic, hateful, ignorant, demeaning, transactional, even violent, exploitative. And you go, well, that is a most unsacred person. That's an unholy person. It's not a good person. I don't want to be around them. But again, you've confused what is sacred with your judgments and expectations of what sacred should look like. But the sacredness doesn't exist in the content. It is a fundamental quality of the context within which all that content appears. To use an analogy, you could think of a beautiful piece of art paper, hand pressed using the finest quality paper there is. And an artist holds this piece of paper, this canvas, lovingly, feeling the texture, the quality, and giving thanks to what can be created on this canvas. Now, the artist proceeds and paints the picture. They may paint a very beautiful picture that evokes feelings of warmth and love and expansion, like a beautiful sunset on a beach somewhere, or nature scene with waterfalls falling off a rock and all sorts of things. Or the artist could paint something very ugly, very hideous, something that evokes feelings of fear and disgust and repulsion and anxiety. And you go, I don't want that painting hanging in my room. I want nothing to do with that painting. It's gross. It repels me. No, no, that's the painting I want. The one with the beautiful sunset. I want to gaze at it every day. What a beautiful painting that is. And that's fine. Those are our preferences because we are sensitized to certain expressions that evoke certain feel good sensations within us. And we're also sensitized to negative things that evoke other emotions within us. Yet none of those emotional reactions have anything to do with the fundamental beauty of the canvas itself. For without that canvas, the painting would be impossible. The artist can try and paint in air all they want, and you would never see a painting. The canvas, the blank canvas, is a hallowed ground upon which the entire artistry unfolds. And so when we begin to perceive beyond just the appearance of the form to the fundamental core essence of the form, which is its very isness, its very being here. Just as I can feel my own presence, I can feel the presence of the world around me. That presence itself is the present. That is the gift, not the forms themselves, because the forms are always transforming. The forms transform, they never remain. My mood now will be very different from my mood later. My body now will be slightly different than my body later. My cells are changing as we speak. Everything is changing. The environment, the people moving in and out of it, our thoughts about them, our thoughts about ourselves. These are in constant flux. Yet the one thing that is the absolute constant at all time is the very fact of their existence, the very essence of their existence, which is the isness itself, the being, the I am, the you are, the this is, all different facets of the same thing, the being underlying this whole display, this kaleidoscope display we call life. And when you begin to orient your attention from time to time, it doesn't have to be anything constant, from time to time, away from the form to the base, away from the happening to the being, away from the what to the is in the what is. Over time, a gradual, spontaneous appreciation for not the existence of the form, but the very fact of its existence arises. A feeling of gratitude for existence itself. And when the Buddha talked about impermanence, and when the Zen poets muse on impermanence through symbolizations of the cherry blossoms falling and blooming only for a few days every spring before they fall. They're not musing on the cherry blossoms in themselves. What they're truly musing on is that which allows all this transformation to keep happening. The seasons changing. What is it that supports the very change of the seasons from spring into summer, from summer into fall, from fall into winter, and then back into spring again? What contains the experience of birth and aging and triumph and defeat and death? What is this vessel in which it is all happening? What is this container in which we are unconditionally held at all times? It's this present moment. It's this now. It's always been this now. It's always been this present moment. And when one sees that, when one sees the very thing that contains it all, there's a sense of how sacred it all is, how miraculous, how divine, how unexpected and unknown, and yet familiar at the same time. So familiar, it almost seems mundane to the mind. Mundane to the point where the mind doesn't even notice it beyond a certain point. And that sacredness infuses everything that exists. It infuses the lives of everyone. It infuses everything that occurs in your environment. It infuses everything that arises in your body. It infuses everything that you see happening around you and to you, including the shit, the flowers, and the soil, and the muck, the mud in which the lotus blooms. All of it arises in this.